Hi folks, my name is Ethan Hine. Welcome to the first episode of my brand new podcast. I'm going to be talking to you about songs that I love and the reasons that I love them and the backstory on their creation, how they work. Thanks very much for listening. So in this very first episode, I'm going to be talking to you about Peter Piper by Run-DMC from their album Raising Hell, which came out in 1986 when I was 11 years old. And when I was 11 years old, I loved this album. So I'm not going to talk that much about the lyrics to the song. I do love them. It's an homage to their DJ, Jam Master Jay, the late, great Jam Master Jay. I do want to point out this one line. He's the big bad wolf in your neighborhood, not bad meaning bad, but bad meaning good. See the big bad wolf in your neighborhood, not bad meaning bad, but bad meaning good. I would love for somebody to say about me that I am bad, not bad meaning bad, but bad meaning good. But mainly what I want to talk about is the instrumental portion of the track created by Jam Master Jay, especially the main sample that runs through it. The main sample that runs through it connects back to Paul Simon. And when I was 11 years old, I also loved Paul Simon. I still do. And I had no way of knowing that Run-DMC and Paul Simon were connected in any way. So the Paul Simon song that begins this journey is called Take Me to the Mardi Gras off Paul Simon's 1973 album, Here Comes Rhymin' Simon. Come on, take me to the Mardi Gras, where the people sing. So a couple of years after Here Comes Rhymin' Simon came out, a jazz musician named Bob James, a kind of jazz fusion artist, did a cover of Take Me to the Mardi Gras. But now let me play you the track from the beginning and you'll hear why it's the basis of an all-time hip-hop classic. So that is a pretty crazy intro. There's a lot going on there. There are the go-go bells, ding, 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 ding. But there's also like radio static mixed in there. Or not radio static, but it just sounds like somebody's flipping channels on the radio. And there's actually a couple of different identifiable songs in that kind of background radio texture. So one of them it's called Rise and Shine by Tommy Cash.
Little children, do not worry, 'cause you still got lots of time. There's no need in walking backwards, turn around and rise and shine. You load always...
And you can just about hear the line Rise and Shine if you listen really carefully. There's also a single chord from Sammy Davis Jr.'s recording of Candyman. It's a little bit harder to make out, but if you listen very closely, it's in there. So it's interesting that this Bob James track has been sampled many, 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 many times. WhoSampled.com lists more than 500 uses in, official commercial releases, and that's not counting however many, mixtape tracks, amateur productions, things like that. I think it's delightful that a track that's been sampled this many times itself contains a couple of samples. In addition to that beat from the beginning, there are a couple of other spots in this track that show up in Peter Piper by Run-DMC. And one of them is just the beginning of the melody, but the other is this little moment right at the beginning of the keyboard solo. So we're coming out of the melody and into Bob James' piano solo. Peter Piper was made in 1986. Digital samplers existed, but they were not widely used. They were, mainly you could only do your digital sampling using like a Fairlight CMI, which cost, $100,000. In Raising Hell, they're not using digital samples at all. All these samples that you hear are actually being played on turntables from vinyl records. So what Jam Master Jay is doing is he's got 2 copies of Take Me to the Mardi Gras. And while one copy is playing, he's queuing up the other one to the beginning of the next kind of sample that he's going to be using, the next little segment, and then slams the crossfader over. Turntable number 2 starts playing. Meanwhile, on turntable number 1, he's queuing up that copy of the record to the beginning of the spot, to the beginning of the loop or the sample. I don't know if you have ever tried DJing with vinyl. It is very, very difficult. I mean, very difficult. It takes a lot of practice. I would say it's comparable to like classical violin in terms of just the amount of dedicated practice that it takes. It's not a good hobby. You really got to devote your whole existence to it. It's definitely easier to do this kind of stuff on the computer, although still takes a lot of practice. So in addition to Take Me to the Mardi Gras, there is one other record that was used on Peter Piper. It's called I Can't Stop by John Davis and the Monster Orchestra. Many people who sampled this record were going for, that drum break, but Jam Master Jay is using the horn blast, and you can hear him scratch it in.
Not bad, meaning bad, but bad, meaning good. There it is.
So the only sounds on Peter Piper are records being played on turntables and a Roland TR 808 drum machine, and that is it. And maybe the track sounds a little bit old-fashioned to you now, especially if you listen to a lot of hip-hop, but in 1986, it was unbelievably futuristic. I mean, it was so hard, right? Just this drum machine, we were not used to the sound of the 808 yet, and then just records being played as musical instruments, which still, I think, all these decades later is like a fairly mind-blowing concept. The idea that you would take a recording of an existing piece of music and not just use segments of it in your music, but perform it as a musical instrument. I feel like the culture hasn't fully caught up with the implications of that idea. Yeah, just still, to my mind, like a really futuristic idea. And, the sound of the track itself is pretty kind of stark. It's very minimalist. Like there's no guitars, there's no chords, there's some little snatches of melody, but they're pretty sparse. Like the main melodic idea in the track, other than the voices of the MCs, is just da 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 da, right? Those 2 pitches being played on bells. Mostly the track is just about sound. It's about the sound of the 808, the sound of the beats, the sound of the right, the turntable scratching.
There it is.
So Peter Piper has itself been sampled quite a few times.
I like the way you work that. Ladies, whoa, you sure know how to work that.
The bells themselves, right, as I mentioned earlier, have been sampled hundreds of times. People don't always use the entire loop. Sometimes they just use the very beginning of it. So instead of ding 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 ding, they just use ding ding ding, just that much of it. So for example, here's King of the Beats by Mantronix. And King of the Beats has itself been sampled many, many, many times. So for example, here's The Power by Snap. I love hip hop as an art form. I mean, I love, rap, the vocal, the vocal form of rap, the writing, the wordplay. But the main thing that drew me into hip hop as an adult, like as a musician, is really the instrumental component of it, especially sample-based hip-hop, this idea of taking existing music and repurposing it in this way. I'm especially impressed when people take unpromising raw material and shape it into something that kind of transcends its source material. So, with all due respect to Bob James, who's a great musician, Take Me to the Mardi Gras. It's okay. Yeah, it's not the kind of thing that I would necessarily throw on for my own enjoyment. I might notice the first couple seconds of it are pretty happening, but then the main song would start and I would lose interest. What I think deserves more respect, especially from musicians, is the imagination that it takes to hear that record and think, okay, but there's a couple of little pieces of it that, if you put them over a hard drum machine beat and just looped them up and scratched them and had people rapping on top of them, then you could really have something. Sampling is somewhat stigmatized among musicians. There's this idea that it's lazy or unethical in some way. For a lot of musicians, legality doesn't even enter into it. It's just the idea that it's cheating somehow, like it's too easy or you're stealing from someone else. And I myself used to believe that very strongly. Like if you'd asked me when I was 20 years old, do you think that it's okay to use someone else's music in your music without their permission? I would have said absolutely not. If you had then said to me, well, remember all those rap albums that you loved when you were a kid and that you still think sound really cool, those would not be possible without this act that you consider to be so lazy and dishonest, I would have said, I hadn't really thought it through. And when I did have to start thinking it through as an adult, I did realize that my sort of moral opposition to it made no sense. Because who is Run-DMC hurting exactly, right? Like, I can assure you, I would not know who Bob James is, nor would I care, had they not sampled Take Me to the Mardi Gras in Peter Piper. I don't think Bob James has lost any record sales due to Run-DMC, probably quite the opposite, yeah? But it's not just about money. Yeah, it's the idea that they did this without permission, that they didn't consult Bob James. And I feel like anybody who feels very strongly about that, about the morality of it, it's something that I talk about with my students a lot. They feel torn between, the right of somebody like Jam Master Jay to, just use the sounds that are available to him in new ways versus the right of Bob James to have some say over how his recordings get used. It's a tough one. I mean, my students very often come down to who has more privilege in this situation, right? Because a person with less privilege should always be allowed to sample somebody with more privilege. Or another way to say it is, well, if you're a good person, then you should be allowed to do whatever you want. I mean, obviously you should be able to prevent your song from being sampled by a bad person. Now, of course, this is a difficult thing to turn into an actionable policy, like who's going to decide who has more privilege, who is going to decide who is a good or a bad person. So, this moral impulse that my students have, it's very admirable, but it's also kind of impractical. I will say very briefly that if you want to make a piece of music using samples of an existing piece of music, officially you need permission from two different people or entities. And one of them is the composer of the original piece of music, and the other is the owner of the sound recording. So the owner of the sound recording is not usually the artist, it's usually the record label. So Run-DMC, had they wanted to seek permission for using Take Me to the Mardi Gras, would have needed permission from CTI, the record label, Creed Taylor International, the people who put out the Bob James record. And they also would have needed Paul Simon's permission because he is the composer of Take Me to the Mardi Gras. Would they have even needed Bob James' permission? If he's not an owner of the recording, actually, no, probably not. Morally, would it have been a good idea? Probably. I don't think Run-DMC sought anybody's permission because in 1986, hip hop, it was an underground music. It wasn't commercially very significant. You didn't hear it a lot unless you were, in New York, LA, Chicago, Detroit, Houston, I guess, right? Cities like that. It wasn't on the radio. Run-DMC did start to break through with Walk This Way. They started to be on TV a little bit, yeah. But it would be several more years before hip-hop really became the gigantic commercial force it became. And it wasn't until 1992 that lawsuits started over unlicensed samples. So there's this kind of magical era through the 80s and up to about 1992 where hip-hop producers are pretty much just doing what they want. Either they don't know that they need permission for samples, or they know but they don't care. And, you get these tracks that are just full of samples that would be unbelievably difficult, if not impossible, or prohibitively expensive to clear. And I do think it's good for people to clear their samples, but, there is something magical about this era of, this kind of free-for-all. that you do get this sort of this playful use of existing pop cultural material that it gets a lot less playful once large sums of money are involved. So there you have it. Peter Piper by Run-DMC, a favorite song of mine when I was a kid, a favorite song of mine now as an adult. Thank you very much for listening.
Is it worth it? Let me work it.
Turn around and rise and shine.